The Atlantic was calm that morning. The sun rose slowly across the eastern horizon, painting the ocean in soft strokes of gold and silver, and for a brief moment, the world felt ordinary. Cargo ships moved along their lonely path. Passenger jets cut quiet white lines into the sky. Somewhere far below the surface, deep-sea cables hummed with the endless noise of human conversation, financial transactions, military signals, and forgotten secrets. It was a morning like any other. And then it wasn't. The first sign was small, a subtle disturbance in the upper atmosphere. A flicker of pressure that satellites recorded but no engineer immediately understood. Within seconds, that flicker became a wound. The sky above the central Atlantic split open in a slow, deliberate motion, as though something ancient were carefully unsealing a door that had been locked for thousands of years. Clouds began circling the opening, drawn inward like iron filings to a magnet. Lightning crawled across the rim in long golden veins, illuminating the water below with a glow that did not belong to this century. In Vought Tower, alarms began ringing on floors most employees did not know existed. Satellites blinked offline one by one. A naval fleet stationed 200 miles north of the disturbance lost all communication within 40 seconds. 3 commercial aircraft vanished from radar. Military command centers across 4 continents lit up at once, voices overlapping, orders contradicting, fear spreading faster than information. Nobody understood what was happening. They only understood that something had arrived. Then he emerged. He stepped through the tear in the sky as if walking through an open gate, and the storm bent around him with a respect the modern world had never seen. His cloak moved without wind. His eyes held the patience of a man who had watched empires rise and fall and rise again. Across his chest burned a symbol older than any flag flying on the planet below, a mark that whispered of a forgotten kingdom, of buried thrones, of a name the desert had once feared. Black Adam descended slowly. He did not race toward the world. He did not announce himself with violence. He simply lowered through the clouds with the calm certainty of a man returning home after a long, unwanted absence. Lightning followed him in quiet companionship, threading between his fingers and along his shoulders like loyal servants. Within minutes, every news network on Earth had cut to the same trembling footage. Helicopter cameras shook. Anchors stumbled over their words. Social media erupted into a global gasp. People stood frozen in living rooms and city streets, eyes lifted upward, unsure whether they were witnessing salvation or something far more dangerous. Inside Vought Tower, the reaction was different. There was no fear. There was calculation. Executives gathered around glass tables, watching the live feed with the hungry expression of men who had just seen a new product line walk out of the sky. Stanley Edgar leaned forward, fingers steepled. Madeline Stillwell tilted her head. Someone whispered the word marketable. Someone else whispered the word 7. Within the hour, internal documents were already being drafted. Merchandise concepts, brand alignment strategies, theme song proposals. A new hero had arrived and Vought intended to own him before sunset. But high above the ocean, the man they intended to package was no hero. He was a king. He had not crossed the boundary between worlds to be sold. He had not bent the laws of physics to wear a smiling logo on his chest. He had stepped through that storm because something in this universe had called to him. Some imbalance, some festering corruption that even another world could feel. And as he hovered above the waves, listening to the chatter of satellites, the panic of governments, and the quiet greed of corporate towers, his expression did not change. He only listened. He listened to a planet that worshipped manufactured saviors. He listened to a culture that confused fame with virtue. He listened to the laughter of executives counting profits over body bags. And slowly, beneath the ancient calm of his face, something began to harden. Vought believed it had discovered an opportunity. A future member of the 7. A new icon to plaster across billboards and breakfast cereal boxes. They were already preparing the contracts, the press releases, the carefully rehearsed handshake. They had not yet realized their mistake. Black Adam had not come to join their world. He had come to judge it. The first meeting was arranged with the same precision Vought used for every public spectacle. A private airstrip. A line of black vehicles polished to a mirror shine. A reception team trained to smile through anything. Executives in tailored suits stood in a perfect crescent, holding folders thick with offers, contracts, and carefully worded promises. Cameras waited at a respectful distance, their lenses already focused, ready to capture the moment a new god agreed to become a brand. Black Adam landed without sound, no gust of wind, no theatrical flourish. He simply appeared on the tarmac as though he had always been standing there, and the silence that followed was the kind that makes confident men quietly check their pulse. Stanley Edgar stepped forward first, extending a hand with practiced warmth. He spoke of partnership, of opportunity, of a world that had been waiting for someone exactly like him. Adam did not take the hand. He studied it. He studied the man behind it. He studied the carefully arranged smiles, the rehearsed posture, the cologne masking the sweat. And he said nothing. Inside the executive lounge, the offers began. Wealth beyond measure, a penthouse above the city skyline, endorsement deals stretching across every continent, a custom suit designed by the finest tailors in Milan, a personal security detail, a film franchise, a seat at the table of the most powerful corporation on earth. They spoke quickly, eagerly, layering temptation upon temptation the way a merchant lays silks before a visiting prince. Adam listened in complete stillness. When they finished, he asked a single question. He asked what they wanted in return. The room laughed gently, the way wealthy men laugh when they believe a deal is already done. They told him the answer was simple. Loyalty. A few carefully chosen appearances. A uniform with the right logo in the right place. Nothing he could not handle. Nothing a hero would refuse. He rose from his chair slowly. He walked to the tall window that overlooked the city, and for a long moment he watched the streets below. He saw billboards selling courage. He saw children wearing the faces of strangers across their chests. He saw a culture that had learned to applaud whatever it was told to applaud. And then he turned, and the temperature in the room dropped by a degree no thermostat could measure. He told them that heroism was not a product. He told them that virtue could not be licensed. He told them that the moment a man sold his power, he ceased to deserve it. His voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. Every word landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. The executives tried to recover. They smiled harder. They adjusted their tone. They spoke of compromise, of cultural differences, of finding a middle path. Adam did not respond. He simply walked out, and the doors closed behind him with the soft finality of a verdict. Over the following days, he moved through the world unannounced. He walked through hospitals where insurance denied dying patients. He stood in neighborhoods where heroes had crushed homes during photo opportunities. He watched press conferences where tragedies were spun into merchandise. He read leaked reports. He listened to whispered confessions. He saw a civilization that had confused spectacle with salvation, and his patience, ancient as it was, began to thin. Inside Vought Tower, the mood shifted. Marketing teams that had been celebrating now sat in tense silence. Focus groups returned strange results. Public attention, once anchored firmly to Homelander's smile, began drifting toward the quiet stranger who refused to perform. Talk shows debated him. Theologians invoked him. Children drew him in crayon without being told to. He had not signed a single contract, yet the world was already beginning to turn its face in his direction. In a private office on the highest floor, Homelander watched the footage alone. He watched the way crowds parted around Adam. He watched the way Adam never smiled for the camera. He watched, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. It was not anger. Not yet. It was the beginning of fear. The confrontation was inevitable. Homelander had spent his entire engineered life as the highest point on every horizon, the brightest light in every room, the unchallenged face on every screen. He had been built to be worshipped, and for years the world had obliged. So when public attention began bending around a stranger who refused to perform, something inside him cracked in a quiet, dangerous way. He decided the encounter would happen on his terms, in public, with the entire planet watching. He chose a plaza in the center of the city, a place where Vought had hosted countless rallies, where his image had been projected onto buildings the size of small mountains. News crews were notified hours in advance. Crowds gathered, drones hovered. Marketing teams prepared 3 different victory statements. Everything had been arranged for a coronation disguised as a meeting. Black Adam arrived without warning. He descended from the clouds in complete silence and landed on the marble at the center of the plaza, his boots making no sound on the polished stone. The crowd hushed. The drones drifted closer. Homelander stepped forward with his trademark smile, arms slightly open, the practiced posture of a man who had never doubted his own welcome. He spoke first, of course. He spoke about America, about strength, about the responsibility of being the most powerful man in the world. He spoke the way actors speak, with rhythm and lighting and the subtle awareness of which camera was closest. And as he spoke, he waited for the stranger to react the way everyone always reacted. With awe, with nervousness, with the quiet shrinking of someone standing beside greatness. Adam did not shrink. He did not smile. He did not even blink at the right moments. He simply watched. And in that watching, Homelander felt something he had not felt since the laboratory. He felt seen. Adam did not see a hero. He did not see a symbol. He did not see the carefully constructed God of the modern age. He saw a frightened boy in a costume too large for him. He saw the tantrums hidden behind the speeches. He saw the loneliness behind the laughter. He saw the rage that lived in the spaces between applause. He saw all of it in a single unhurried glance, and his expression did not change. When Homelander finished his speech, he extended a hand for the cameras. A handshake. A moment to be replayed forever. Adam looked at the hand the way a man looks at a piece of paper offered by a stranger. Then he looked back at Homelander's eyes and he said quietly that power was not a costume, that a true ruler did not need permission from a corporation, that the man before him was not a god, he was a product. The plaza went silent. The drones recorded every syllable. Somewhere in Vought Tower, a marketing executive dropped a coffee cup. Homelander's smile remained frozen on his face, but the muscles beneath it began to twitch. His laser eyes flickered, just for a moment, as if the body remembered violence before the mind authorized it. He laughed. He tried to recover. He cracked a joke about jet lag and ancient kings. Nobody laughed with him. Adam did not press the moment. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. He simply turned and walked away, the crowd parting around him in a hush that felt almost religious. The cameras followed him long after he had gone. The footage would replay for weeks. Anchors would dissect every second. Therapists would later describe it as the moment a manufactured god first met a real one. Back in his private quarters that night, Homelander stood before a mirror for a long time. He stared at his own reflection, at the perfect jaw, the perfect hair, the perfect blue of his eyes. And for the first time, he could not quite recognize the person staring back. He had been called many things in his life. Tonight, for the first time, he had been called small. And the worst part was that he believed it. Adam did not begin his investigation with violence. He began it with patience. He moved through the world quietly, the way a doctor moves through a sick room, listening before diagnosing. He walked through hospitals where children lay connected to machines that hummed with a chemical their parents had never agreed to. He sat in the back rows of courtrooms where families were silenced by settlements written in language designed to confuse. He stood at the edges of crash sites where heroes had landed badly and the bodies of bystanders had been quietly relabeled as collateral acceptable losses. He listened to whistleblowers in empty parking garages. He read documents leaked by trembling interns. He visited a small town in the Midwest where a single careless punch from a beloved hero had collapsed a school bus, and where the official report listed the cause of death as a tragic accident involving aging infrastructure. He listened to a mother who had been paid to be silent and who could no longer bear the silence. He did not interrupt her. He did not promise her revenge. He only listened, the way the desert listens, the way old gods listen. What he found was not a single corrupt company. It was a kingdom. A vast, gleaming kingdom of lies, built layer by layer over decades, defended by lawyers, polished by publicists, and protected by a population too entertained to ask difficult questions. At the center of it sat Compound V, the chemical secret that had birthed every hero the world cheered for. Injected into infants without consent, hidden behind origin stories carefully written in marketing departments. None of them had been chosen by destiny. All of them had been chosen by shareholders. The discovery did not surprise him. Corruption was older than language. Empires had risen and rotted long before the first camera was invented. What enraged him was not the existence of the rot. It was the cheerful acceptance of it. A civilization that knew at some quiet level that its heroes were manufactured and that chose the comfort of the lie over the burden of the truth. That to him was the deeper crime. He began acting, not in fury, but in method. A weapons facility producing experimental versions of Compound V vanished overnight. Its concrete walls peeled open as if by a careful hand, its scientists found unharmed but kneeling outside. Their notebooks burned, their hard drives reduced to slag. A laboratory hidden beneath a Vought-owned hospital was emptied before dawn. The children inside delivered quietly to families who had been told for years that their babies had not survived. A private island where executives held their most secret meetings was struck by a single bolt of lightning that left the buildings intact and the records gone. He left no bodies. He took no trophies. He gave no speeches. He simply unmade the machine piece by piece, the way a craftsman disassembles a clock he no longer trusts. And the world began to notice. News anchors who had spent their careers smiling through Vought press releases began stumbling over their scripts. Investigative journalists who had been buried in legal threats suddenly found their stories trending. Documents that had been sealed for decades appeared in inboxes belonging to senators, judges, and foreign ministers. Whistleblowers who had been hiding in fear for years walked into police stations and asked, for the first time, to be heard. Something had shifted in the air. A pressure had lifted. A silence had broken. Inside Vought Tower, panic began to harden into something colder. The seven gathered in a conference room that had once felt like a throne hall and now felt like a bunker. A-Train paced. The deep spoke too much. Black Noir said nothing, as always, but his stillness had changed in texture. Starlight, hidden behind her composure, felt something dangerous and unfamiliar moving beneath her ribs. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was Hope. Homelander sat at the head of the table silent, his hands flat against the polished wood. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He listened to the reports of facilities lost, of executives missing, of subsidiaries collapsing on 3 continents within a single week. And as he listened, he understood, in a way he had refused to understand before, that the man in the sky was not playing the same game. He was not negotiating for territory. He was not building a brand. He was burning a kingdom to the ground, room by room, with the patient certainty of someone who had done it before. Stanley Edgar leaned toward him and whispered that they needed a response. Something visible. Something final. Homelander did not answer immediately. He was watching the window. The clouds outside were beginning to gather in a pattern he did not yet recognize but somehow already feared. Vought did not surrender. Empires rarely do. When the executives finally accepted that no contract, no bribe, and no carefully worded press conference could turn back the storm circling their kingdom, they did what frightened men have always done. They reached for the weapons they had built when they still believed themselves untouchable. The seven were assembled. Private armies were activated. Military contacts were called in old, debt-laden voices. Governments were pressured with files thick enough to topple administrations. The order was simple. End him, whatever the cost. The battle did not begin in a desert or a remote island, the way these things were supposed to. It began in the heart of a city, beneath a sky already heavy with low golden clouds. Adam stood in an open square, surrounded by glass towers, his cloak motionless. He had not come looking for the fight. He had come because Vought had chosen the location, hoping the presence of civilians would force him to hesitate. They had misunderstood him completely. He did not hesitate. He simply made sure that no innocent stood between him and the men who had come to die. A-Train arrived first, a streak of red moving faster than the human eye could follow. He struck Adam at full speed, expecting bone to break, expecting a body to fly. Adam did not move. A-Train collapsed at his feet, breathing, alive, but suddenly aware that he had run his entire life and never once met something that could not be outrun. The deep came next, dragged into the fight by ambition he did not actually possess. He was set aside almost gently, lifted into the air and lowered onto a rooftop, the way a man removes a child from a dangerous street. Then the sky darkened in earnest. Black Noir came from above, silent as always, blades drawn, every movement perfect. For a moment, even Adam acknowledged the craftsmanship. Then a single open palm met a single descending strike. and the silence between them ended with a sound the city would remember for years. Noir did not rise. The military arrived in waves. Jets cut across the skyline, missiles streaking toward the figure standing in the square. Adam looked up once, and the missiles unmade themselves in midair, their components drifting harmlessly to the ground like falling leaves. Tanks rolled in. Drones swarmed. Helicopters circled. Every weapon a modern civilization had built to feel safe was thrown at one man, and one by one, each was set aside without cruelty and without mercy. Above the city, lightning began to gather. Not in bolts, in structures. Cathedrals of golden energy formed in the clouds, vast and patient, the way storms must have looked to ancient eyes that did not yet have words for them. People watching from windows whispered prayers in languages they had not spoken since childhood. Children pointed upward. Old men wept without knowing why. The sky had remembered something the world had forgotten. And then Homelander came. He did not arrive with speeches. He arrived in silence, the way a man arrives at a duel he knows he cannot win but cannot refuse. His suit was torn before he had thrown a single punch, ripped by the speed of his own descent. His eyes burned red before he had spoken a word. He had spent his entire life as the ceiling above every other being. Tonight, for the first time, he had come to test whether there was anything above him. The first impact cracked windows for 40 blocks. The second collapsed a parking structure. The third sent both of them spiraling into the clouds, leaving a trail of fractured air behind them. They fought across the sky like figures from an older mythology, two suns colliding above a city that had forgotten what real power looked like. Buildings trembled. Glass rained downward in slow, glittering sheets. The ocean 100 miles away registered the disturbance and pulled back from the shore. Homelander gave everything he had. He used speeds he had never reached. He used heat he had never released. He shouted, he raged, he laughed the unhinged laughter of a man trying to convince himself that he was still winning. And through all of it, Adam fought without anger. He fought the way a teacher disciplines a student who has confused volume with strength. Each blow he returned carried not hatred but instruction. Each pause between strikes carried an unspoken sentence. You are not what you believed you were. The end did not come with a killing blow. It came with a single moment of stillness high above the clouds when Homelander, bleeding light from his nose and his mouth, looked across the storm and finally understood. There were levels of power above him. There always had been. He had simply never been allowed to meet one. He fell. Not dead. Not destroyed. Only diminished in the most permanent way a man can be diminished. He fell through the storm, through the smoke, through the ruined sky, and landed in a city that no longer feared him. Above, the lightning quieted. The kingdom of lies had ended. The world that woke the next morning did not know what to call itself. The seven were gone. Vought Tower stood half empty, its boardrooms abandoned, its servers seized, its stock symbol frozen on every exchange. The men who had ruled from behind the curtain were either in custody, in hiding, or quietly negotiating their futures from villas they no longer believed were safe. Heroes who had spent their careers pretending to be saviors stood in the streets in plain clothes, suddenly aware that the cameras were no longer pointed at them. A great silence had settled across the planet, the kind of silence that follows the end of a long, loud lie. And in that silence, every nation began to ask the same question. Who fills the throne now? Some answered quickly. Smaller countries that had suffered most under Vought's influence sent emissaries to Adam before the dust had even settled. They offered alliances. They offered crowns. They offered the kind of titles that have ended civilizations more often than they have saved them. They were not foolish. They had simply looked at the world and decided that a just king, however dangerous, was preferable to 100 dishonest committees. Adam received each delegation with patience. He listened. He asked careful questions. He did not refuse, and he did not accept. Other nations reacted differently. Older powers, accustomed to writing the rules themselves, looked at the man in the sky and saw not a savior but a precedent. They feared what it meant for a single being to dismantle their largest corporation in a matter of weeks. They feared what it meant that the population in many places was not afraid of him. Editorials were written warning of the danger of benevolent rulers. Panels of experts debated whether a kindly tyrant was still a tyrant. Religious leaders argued for hours over whether obedience to a just power was virtue or surrender. The debate spread into ordinary homes. At dinner tables, families argued about whether peace imposed from above was still peace. In classrooms, students asked teachers questions the curriculum had not prepared anyone to answer. In bars and on buses and in waiting rooms, strangers found themselves talking honestly, perhaps for the first time, about what it meant to be free. Not free to consume, not free to scroll. Free in the older, heavier sense of the word. Adam himself heard all of it. He did not retreat into a palace. He walked among the people. He sat on park benches and listened to old men argue. He stood at the back of town halls and watched citizens shout at one another with a passion they had not felt in years. He visited a school where children asked him, with the brutal honesty only children possess, whether he was going to become their new king. He did not answer them quickly. He thought for a long time, and then he told them that he did not yet know. The truth, which he revealed to no one, was that the question troubled him. He had been a ruler before. He remembered the weight of it. He remembered the way absolute order, no matter how just at its source, slowly hardened into something colder around its edges. He remembered the loyal advisors who became careful flatterers, the eager subjects who became silent ones, the laws that began as protection and ended as cages. He had freed a kingdom once and watched it rebuild its own chains within a generation. He was not certain he wished to test that lesson again. At night, alone above the clouds, he looked down at the cities glittering beneath him, and he allowed himself a thought he had rarely allowed before. Perhaps the strongest thing a man of power could do was refuse to use it. Perhaps the deepest form of rule was the willingness to walk away from the throne. Perhaps freedom, with all its mess and noise and contradictions, was not a weakness in a civilization. Perhaps it was the only proof that the civilization was still alive. He did not yet have his answer. But for the first time in many ages, he was willing to wait for it. In the end, he chose silence over a crown. It was not a dramatic departure. There was no farewell speech. There was no parade. One quiet morning, the world simply noticed that the figure in the sky was no longer there. The clouds above the Atlantic had returned to their ordinary shapes. The lightning had gone home. The man who had broken a kingdom in a season had left without taking a single piece of it for himself. The seven were already a memory. Vought was being dismantled in courtrooms and committee rooms, its name being scrubbed from stadiums and cereal boxes and the sides of orphanages it had pretended to fund. Compound 5 was being studied openly now by scientists who no longer feared the consequences of telling the truth. Children who had been hidden in laboratories were going home. Families who had been paid to be silent were speaking. A long, careful rebuilding had begun, the kind that does not photograph well but changes everything underneath. People argued, of course. They argued about whether he should have stayed. They argued about whether he had been a hero or a warning. They argued about whether the world was truly better or simply quieter. Books were written. Documentaries were filmed. Theologians and philosophers and tired parents all had their opinions. None of them agreed. All of them remembered. Because that was the thing he had given them, in the end. Not a ruler, not a savior, not a new face on a new billboard. He had given them a memory of what real power looked like when it was carried by someone who did not need applause. A memory of what it felt like to live for a brief season in a world where the strongest being did not lie. A memory that would sit, quietly, at the back of every conversation about heroes for generations to come. Children drew him in their notebooks. Old men spoke of him the way their grandfathers had spoken of saints. Songs were written in languages he had never visited, sung by voices that had only seen him through a screen. He had refused worship, and so, in the strange way of human beings, he was remembered with something deeper than worship. He was remembered with respect. And somewhere above the clouds, on quiet nights when the world below had finally begun to sleep without fear, a single thread of golden lightning would sometimes cross the sky. Travelers would look up. Sailors would pause on the decks of their ships. A child on a porch in a small town would tug at a mother's sleeve and point upward without knowing why. There would be no thunder. There would be no storm. Only a brief, bright reminder written across the dark that power had once walked among them and had chosen, in the end, to let them rule themselves. The kingdom of lies was gone. The memory of a true king remained.